Welcome everyone to today's social system mapping deep dive session, August 19th, 2024. And as usual, Kara and I are your hosts today. And for our agenda today, we're going to do chat intros, although I think, well, maybe not all of you have met, so we'll do chat intros. And I'm going to talk about a little bit about the philosophical underpinnings and challenges of visualizing connections, which is what social system mapping is fundamentally about. And then we'll open it up to some questions and answers or discussion about that. And then, as you all know, I think you all know, the formal-ish session will go for an hour, and then I'll stick around for an extra half hour if anybody has any further stuff they want to discuss or questions, etc. So let's just go ahead and in the chat, let's share your name, pronoun, location. And I'm going to stop sharing my screen because I can read these with you, to you. And this is really to help us all get a sense of what kind of people are bringing what kind of contexts and what kind of work they're supporting in the world. To both see the breadth of what that is, who's represented here, as well as to appreciate the intentions in that work. So name, pronoun, location, and then what's one primary network that you're part of or working with? And then when you're done with that, love to know what's bringing you here today. What you're looking for. We're hoping to get. And welcome, Amy. I don't see. Let me see. So, Regine, I think part of what I'm going to talk about today, it will feel like sort of background challenge. And hopefully it will give you some thoughts about how to address it, some of that background challenge. Mm-hmm. And for the rest of you, it's just deepening. Mm-hmm. Okay, so Amy, do you want to do a mic check? Are you good before we jump in?
Yes, I'm good. Thank you.
Welcome. Glad you're with us. So, I'm going to confess up front that this is a topic that when it comes up in various places, sometimes I can find very activating or triggering. And so when that happens, then I can get a little bit argumentative and I can start to use words that are not the kinds of words that I really would prefer to be using. And so just thinking about it, my throat is doing its whole little, tightening up thing. And so it might not seem apparent to everybody else why that would be the case. It might seem a little esoteric of a trigger, but I'm gonna just do my best to go slowly and choose my words well. And having said all that, maybe everything will be just fine, but I do need to just sort of acknowledge that that's going on for me. Another thing I want to say is just in my own taking care of my capacity to be here and helpful. is I'm gonna close my chat now. I'm closing it now, or I just did. And that's because when I see things in the chat, I find it very, like my head goes in 5 places and it takes me time to find where I was, and that I can find sort of activating as well. And then I get sped up and get anxious. And so I'm not gonna be in the chat, and I'm gonna ask, I know Amy, you're on a phone, so this might not be what I was gonna say is I'm gonna ask somebody, and my choice would be Amy, to just keep an eye on the chat. And if it feels like there's something that is important and relevant to surface while I'm talking, to interrupt me and point it out. But otherwise, I'm not gonna be paying attention to it. And I'm guessing Amy's not in the right position to do that. So Jim, I will ask you, and I will trust you to sense into like what's what's best for the whole at the moment, or else what is just has to be dealt with because it's activating for somebody. But that doesn't mean every single thing I want to get interrupted for instantly, just for clarification. Okay, thank you. Thank you for being willing to do that. Okay, so I'm sensing that this, I feel a little silly because I feel like this really isn't that controversial a topic. And there are places where I would get pushback for it, or I would know that there are other people in this community who could get feel disrespected or trivialized, especially if I'm in my triggered mode. And so it's not that it's just a slight philosophical difference that brings tensions into our context. And what I'm trying to do is learn how to ease into those places more gracefully and more responsibly, because I know that they come up and I kind of go, what? And then everybody kind of goes, I'm exaggerating. It's really micro. This is micro, but it's still real and it still has an impact. So I feel a little silly for saying all of this preparatory stuff, but it's part of my learning how to step into being in this space with a little more clarity. So what it has to do with is mapping connections. And part of a thing that comes up often, both in my work with my clients, and I hear this from other people, or sometimes I'll hear this when someone is presenting a map or when they're preparing to do something, that that gathering connections is a really big ask. Asking people to reveal their relationship, to even just, often it's not even framed as an emotional thing, it's framed as just a technical challenge, like it's too much work, it's a lot of work, people don't want to, they don't want to go through the hassle of updating their connections. And totally understand that. I'm going to talk about why I think that is, and what I think is important about that for us to keep in mind. Welcome, Tim. I don't know if, I think Seth knows Tim, but Regine, this is my partner, Tim Hansen. Tim, that's Regine smiling, waving at you. Tim showed up because he knows I'm going to talk about this, and he knows I feel rather activated about it, and he just wanted to be supportive and have his face smiling at me, which actually is so funny. Yes, okay. Okay, so so going to say some things just about connection in general, and then I'm going to get into the challenge of visualizing it, and then into what I think we can do with that challenge. But so as you all know, no, what did I just say? I was going to start. I'm sorry, my head is bouncing around. It does this when I get anxious. Connection. So I've been in contexts for nearly 20 years now where people talk about we're going to build connections, we're going to build relationships, we all are connected, happy, happy, wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And coming from a place where connection isn't always that happy, happy or fun. It can be hurtful, it can be exploitative, it can be extractive, it can be competitive. I'm always sort of sitting there going, okay, but it's far more complex than that. And I don't want to be connected to lots of kinds of people who will not notice that they're being extractive or exploitative or hurtful or whatever. And so I just want us to note that when we start to talk about connections and making connections, there's this broader background context of part of it is everything is connected to everything in the universe, right? So we all know that whether we choose to be connected or not, we impact each other, everything impacts us, we impact everything, et cetera, at some level, maybe not directly, but indirectly in many tiers down. And so it's not really about creating connections because we're already connected. It's about being more thoughtful and careful and insightful about the connections that exist and what's happening in them. Are they connections that are we aware of the impacts of the connections that we're emphasizing or that we're trying to build? And are we aware enough of them to be able to influence and have an impact that we want, as opposed to connections that are extractive or exploitative? So for instance, you're all sort of familiar, I'm sure, with the theme of funders who want to do well and have a wonderful, good plan and idea, who fund things. And then what's happening is within that field, within that space of what the funders are trying to work on, everybody's competing for scarce funding dollars, and it just turns into a big conflict and sort of a feeding frenzy, as opposed to actually generating the kind of impact people want to have. So this is the tension in networks is building connections, saying we're going to build connections without really understand, and then treating it like it's just a big party and everyone's going to love everybody and everything's going to work out just fine without having a deepening of insight into what's going on in those connections, or an understanding of how things are flowing. So and we have these, like, we tend to use these like lovely nature images of birds flocking and have this vision that we're all going to just start all self-organizing and moving together in the same way. And and that's a wonderful vision, and that's a wonderful ideal and goal, and I'm not discounting everyone's intention to move in that direction. But what I'm pointing to is that I have to say, my inner critic is doing this thing, and I said this so much more clearly and so much more succinctly when Tim and I were on our walk yesterday. And part of me is like, I don't know that I want Tim here, because he's going to be like, man, you really blew it. and but there's another part of me that's just surfacing how profoundly our brains get impacted when we're dealing with like being triggered, etc. I get way less articulate and way less succinct, and I'm aware of that. And then I have debates going on in my head and criticism, and it just turns into like, I just want to stop now and go away. Okay. So we have been conditioned by, some a debatable number of millennia of patriarchy and some debatable number of hundreds of years of mechanistic science to not come together. As human beings, we are wired for connection. That I believe is really, really true. And at the same time, we are wired for trauma and competition, and we have all these ways of hurting each other and being mistrustful of each other. And I'm not trying to be a Debbie Downer here. I'm just trying to say this is what's going on. This is underneath our work. This is always present in our work, is the impacts of the ways that we as humans don't flock together. We either, oh, it's too much. Okay. Anyway, that's there. I'm just going to say that's there. Then I'm going to say, we have this, there was a slide I wanted to show, and some of you have seen this slide already. One of the things that I feel like this work puts us like face to face with all the time is this distinction between, and Kara's going to put the article that this came from in the chat, a link to the article so you can see the whole article, but this distinction from what they're calling a mouth set shift, having performative language about the system shift that we're talking about, and then the continuum of from adopting language through the dissonance of realizing that our language doesn't match our behavior to often a crisis or some kind of breakdown where people can get cynical, lose trust, etc. And then the grunt work of aligning mouth set shifts to mindset shifts, and then finally embodying the language and reflecting it across every part of a system. So this is the spectrum or the shift that is always underneath whatever it is we're doing, because we are talking about shifting from systems of dominance and exploitation and extraction to systems of connection and reverence and regeneration. And so that's a system shift. And what this is about is how systems both are very resilient and will go back to their status quo, and what actually it takes to shift them, which is actually a lot of work. So I wanted to sort of put that all as the sort of background to this dynamic I see over and over. That's not news to me. People will say, oh, it's really hard to get people to do connections. And so I just remove them. I just don't ask them to do that. And, in sumApp, we make it so that you can hide the connections tab. You don't have to gather the connections in sumApp to make, to gather data to make a map in Kumu. In my rigorous social system mapping place, I wouldn't call that a social system map if it doesn't have interpersonal connections in it. I would call it something like a net map, or, there's all kinds of other labels for it. But so you can do that. And I understand that there are lots of contexts where it really isn't relevant, it isn't useful, it isn't worth asking people to go through all that work of gathering, of sharing connections, because the context is not one where there is a coherent intention to, with the same sort of population of people, to go through this shift from mouth set to mindset. That's not always what's going on. If we're having a big one-off global event, that's sort of in this neighborhood of beginning this shift, beginning to talk about the shift and beginning to share our challenges with the shift. But it's not like that particular group is going to stick together and over time create a new system. It will be it will happen. I'm not saying it's not happening, but it's like that's not the supported, resourced intention in the moment. I've been in a lot of those contexts, and that's absolutely fine. It's important first step. And sometimes the only reason people are gathering connections is just for that sort of sensitizing to the concept that how our connections are working, how they're structured, is relevant and important in the kinds of systems shifts that we're trying to make. And I feel really strongly that social system mapping is meant to help us move through this whole dial or through this whole spectrum. It's meant to help us go from simply talking about generative relationships or system change or healthy connection, to go from talking about it through the discomfort of recognizing that we often are connected in ways that we think we want to be. There's often a lot of people left out, or we have a lot of little echo chambers that aren't talking to each other. All of that is really uncomfortable, and if we get into that place of dissonance or breakdown and back up, we as those who are bringing the mapping to a community, if we get to that place and we back up and say, okay, I surrender, we're doing them a disservice. We're letting them, we're part of our job. And so when I say part of our job, it sounds like I'm dictating behaviors for everybody in this large way. And that's not what I'm doing. I'm saying we start where we can start and we do what we can do. But if we want to be supporters of a real shift, a real systems shift, then inherent in that is, whether we're doing it with mapping or doing it in any other place, is doing our best to help move through those uncomfortable places, and not backing up and saying, okay, you're right. I'm not going to subject you to any dissonance. Because we won't change anything if that's what we do. And so I feel like we start where we can, and we don't push hard enough that we get lashback, or we do it in gentle, wise ways, but we have to keep sort of helping people see what is missing that needs to be seen in order to move into the actual realigning and embodying. And that's true at every level. That's true at the level of interpersonal relationships and building belonging. We just need to keep pushing both ourselves, asking us to stretch into places that we're not comfortable with, that we don't entirely understand, that feel kind of scary. And we have to do that at the systems level. And social system mapping is just another place where that comes up. And my strong sense is that we're always doing this. We should be ideally doing this dance of like, okay, I see the point, and I'm gonna back off on this at the moment, but my intention is to keep coming back and bringing it forward. So when we come to a place where people say, whether it's in planning or there's all these places where the same things come up over and over in a mapping project, but people will say, I don't really see the value of mapping connections. My stance is most people don't. That's just the way it is. And our job is to not say, well, I'm going to force you all to give them all, and then you're going to see the value, but to just keep finding the openings, keep finding the places of saying, well, if our funding is about building connections, how can we show that we're building connections if we're not actually mapping them? Or if we say we want to build bridges across differences, how do we know if we're succeeding in building bridges across differences if we don't have, more than a couple anecdotal bits of evidence? If we can we see that at the level, at the scale of whatever our full population is. So there's lots of ways, or when we look at a map and there's lots of connections and people are like, ah, it's a mess, for us to find ways of helping whoever we're working with at that time see into, well, what does this tell us and what could we learn from this? And my experience is that it's really hard and it's really uncomfortable. Especially if you're an outside consultant, which I almost always am. So I don't really know these people really well. I don't really speak their language. I mean, I get their goals and I want to be supportive and I get to know them, but I'm not really one of them. And for me to be sort of doing this push is really uncomfortable. But every time I do, I see that people start with this sort of like mind of like, I'm not going to go there, or this is dumb, or, you know, quit wasting my time. But if I just sort of gradually, or I've watched other people do this, is gradually say, well, let's do some pattern spotting and let's look at it from this angle and let's look at it from that angle. Now, what are we finding? And maybe it's one person out of a group of 10 sees anything valuable, but usually that thing that they see is really valuable and actually is the thing that starts to shift people's thinking. Like they start to go, oh, I hadn't thought of that. And well, maybe that means we're assuming something, or maybe that means we could strengthen something. Like there's all these little teeny places where things can move forward. And my sense is that if what we do is say, yeah, it's hard, I'm not going to ask them for that, that we're missing those opportunities. And I have like this intense response to missing opportunities to actually change. Like we come to these little openings, and if we back up and don't go through them, I find that really scary, because it's like, I don't know how many times we're going to get this opening, and I don't know how many other places that opening exists, and it's an opportunity, and we should. Okay. Tim, I'm gonna are you still there? Is he still there? Did he go away? I'm not seeing him.
He's there. He's there. He's there.
Oh, Amy's still there. Okay. So you guys were below my visual. Oh, and I'm going to stop sharing I forgot to stop screen sharing. So that's partly why I can't see everybody. Tim, is there anything that I said that you think yesterday that, I'm not talking about the way I said it, because clearly I can't reproduce that, but any high level points that you recall from our conversation yesterday that you feel like I've left out?
Yeah, the part about like you had 3 or 4 different kinds of connections. I don't remember what they were, but they seemed very interesting and important and help make the argument really well.
Okay, in that case, I found a slide. This is the piece this is what you're talking about, Tim. I mean, oops. That in nature, we don't think of nature as just like every connection is wonderful. There's different kinds of connections for contexts that are symbiotic. And I know in my mind, I often think of symbiotic as this benefit, like mutualism version, but actually symbiosis just means different kinds of species who are occupying the same space and consuming the same resources. So, if we think of nonprofits, they're in the space of what's being funded, but they have maybe different approaches to the goal or different structures or whatever. So I was a little more clear with this when I was talking with Tim yesterday, but just that there are, there's types of symbiosis. There's mutualism where that are beneficial to both parties. There's commensalism, which is where there's benefits to one party and the other party isn't harmed. They're also not benefited. And then there's parasitism, which is exploitation and extraction in our context, where one benefits and one is harmed. And then there's competition, which, I think, I couldn't find a graphic with competition in it in, nice, simple pictures, but the competition, which just creates conflict in which usually probably both parties are harmed in some way or another. So So I was just wanting, I was gonna frame it in a way about nature to make it less like about bad people, but just to acknowledge that when we're in the same space and we are needing the same resources, there's these things happen. And so they happen both as a result of our conditioning, our social conditioning and our history and scarcity, et cetera. And they also happen in nature. So it's not like I'm, yeah, okay. Was there any piece of that, Tim, that I didn't do justice to that you think I should amplify or you would like to amplify before I stop?
No, that was good.
Okay. So, before we go into like open conversation, I just want to, and I meant to, and I forgot to, so I regret that I forgot to do this, which is I wanted to pause at different points and just see if anybody had any clarifying questions. And if anything was getting like, making it hard to keep paying attention and move forward, like either getting triggered or just getting confused enough to say, or annoyed enough to just say, I can't keep paying attention. So I meant to stop and do that. And I was enough activated that I forgot to. Plus I felt silly enough for my big long prep that I didn't, that scared my head out of my head. So I just want to first now just see if anybody has any clarifying or I'm just really stuck here. I need to surface this thing before we go into expanding or examples or just discussion.
I might have one question, which I think, what is the theme of what you're saying? Like, what is it that instigated this conversation?
So last week, some of you were present for it, and if you weren't, if you watch the video, you'll see it happening. Ben Roberts presented a really cool map that didn't have, where he intentionally did not gather interpersonal connections. And that, when we hadn't noticed that ahead of time, and that just sort of made me, I needed to clarify for people, for the new people, that was a different kind of map, and it's cool, and Ben is very creative and he's pushing the boundaries, and I really appreciate it. And it's not exactly a rigorously classified social system map, because that rests on, I mean, the whole point of social system mapping for me is to understand connections. So I said that, and there came a moment when Ben said, oh, it's really hard to gather connections, so we just didn't. And then another person in the community chimed in with, yes, it's really hard, I wish we didn't have to, or something like that. And that kind of got me a little bit triggered. And then later that same day, Amy and I had a situation where the topic came up, and I didn't say anything because Amy was the lead, and so it was great for me to be able to not say anything, but I noticed that I got a little triggered. Oh, and in the conversation with Ben in the morning, I was trying to make it very neutral, but to say, connections are good. And I got pushback. And then it turned into a little bit of me saying there is a philosophical difference here. And from my perspective, if we're not, looking at connections, then we're missing out on something, which doesn't mean everybody has to, and it always has to be there. But it's like, I don't want people to just, I don't want to be presenting in our community of practice a perspective that takes lightly letting go of the personal relationship. It's like, that is not the thing I'm preaching. It's kind of it's, no one's going to enforce it, but it really matters to me that we do our best to learn how not to drop that ball when it comes to us. And I realized, not just from last week, but it comes up in community practice context, and it comes up with clients. And I want to be more comfortable talking about it. Like usually, and with clients, it's fine. It's like, there's just a little place and I actually don't get triggered, and I can just sort of point things out, and it's a little bit easier. But I wanted both for me to get better at articulating it more clearly, like at the just sort of the generic level of why this matters. And I want to encourage our community of the people in our community of practice to have a deeper insight into why there's value for them in just nudging gently into that uncomfortable space. Does that help, Regine? That was a really good question. I left it out.
It's a really good question.
So thank you for that. Any other clarifying, or I'm stuck? My head's going. Amy, and I know this came up with you later in the day, and so I just want to see if I've caused any tension for you before we go. Like, I just want to make sure you're need, if you have to anything you need to say.
No, I just am finding, I'm super glad that you picked this topic because so Christine's working on a project with me and we're going to meet, she and I are going to meet this afternoon to prepare for our next meeting with this team. And connections is what I wanted to talk about based on the conversation that our team has. So anyway, this is really good. And yes, this is where my head's been thinking, but I don't have anything particular that's coming up. Thank you for asking.
Well, maybe I was feeling you thinking about it as well. And there's a whole lot of energy going into this for me this week. Jim, yeah.
It's interesting because it seems like most of us come to this with the basic assumption that the relationships that we have create the network whereby the resources, ideas, innovations, intentions can flow, and that it's essential to what we do and our purpose. So for there to be pushback is curious to me. But the other thing is, which is a little separate from this.
Can I pause you? So just I just want to come back. I want to close that loop before you go to the next topic. Is that okay? This is a thing I've been practicing also, just for those of you.
And I haven't been practicing it enough to go what.
So I'm helping you.
Thank you.
Closing loop, so we're not all tracking 10 different topics and getting lost. And so and I agree that the challenge is, like, for Amy gets it. Amy has it in her bones. We need to see the relationships, right? But then when she comes into her community, I would say at least 90% of the members of the community don't see the value in mapping relationships. And my stance is it's bigger than not seeing the value. I think it's scary. I think it's scary for a whole lot of reasons. And that scariness is what I'm reacting to. I know it's scary, but don't let them push you backwards, or don't let them rob you. I mean, don't go there. Like, just, there's value. Hold on to that and edge into it, sort of. So Jim, yeah, for us as mappers, I think we get it. And there's that place where you're trying to bring the value to the community and you hit a wall. And I hit it a bazillion times. So
Can I say something?
Okay, but I just want to make sure that are you in the same, is it this the same and Jim is still waiting, so I want to make sure that we get back to him as soon as possible. But yes,
but just in general, kind of about what you're saying, for me, having looked at a lot of maps, and it's if you don't have connections, for me, you essentially have a directory, which can be meaningful in a certain context. And with connections, you have the possibility of something dangerous. And because there's danger there, there's the possibility of change, of doing something transformative, which isn't really possible with just a directory. And it just seems really kind of like that's the difference. One is dangerous, the other is not.
Thanks, Jim.
Sweet.
Okay, Jim, thank you for pausing and allowing me to pause.
Thanks for adding that, Tim. Just so I was thinking about the difference between the focus on the quality of connections and then the other thing that we get from the mapping, which is we can see the structure of the connections. We can see connections are lumped, clustered, open, connected, and that is super valuable in terms of self-awareness and how it affects our purpose.
Yeah. And I think that is where the danger lies.
Can you say more about that?
Yeah. So, and I realize as I'm pausing and we're starting to have a little more back and forth, part of what makes me uncomfortable talking about this is because I think there's a it has to do with both of my relationship to what I'm going to say next, as well as the fact of what I'm going to say next. But people who are, and I know this is a really broadly said thing, which is, I just can't refine it in a really generative way right now, but people who have generally been privileged, have generally been in positions of being supported or being in power, are trained, conditioned to be a lot less aware of the negative sides of their connections to other people. So, you know, white privilege, where people don't really know how they're being painful to other people. They think they're doing the right thing and they're wanting to do the right thing, and but they don't have as much lived experience of being, you know, marginalized or extracted from or exploited. And so that makes it's the people who have power in a context for whom it's dangerous, for whom it's threatening, or the people who have influence, or who either just don't care or don't want to know, or have some deep inkling somewhere that maybe if we could actually see where their influence is coming from, they might lose some power, they might lose some influence. So there's that. And one of the reasons it's hard for me to say it has to do with my relationship in this context, where I have a lot of power and I am a norming kind of an influence, and I'm white and I seem middle class and well educated, all of which makes me look like a highly privileged person. So one can say, from when, you know, what are you, that's, and it's not theory to me because of my actual lived life experience, which isn't what people see when they look at me. So as soon as I start to talk about power and privilege, I get all tied up in knots because I know what I am in this context and what I look like in general, and I know a very different life experience. And so then I start to not know how to talk about it without sounding like an idiot or an asshole or whatever. So that's part of what's going on for me. But so back to your question, Jim, was what's dangerous about it is, like, if we say in our community of practice that we're being egalitarian or we're flat, we're not saying those explicitly things anymore, but and then we look at a map and we see Christine as this great big dot at the center. It's like, oh, there's a power monger. People are like, oh, Christine is like a control freak. And it's like, well, no, actually, I'm the one providing all of this, but we don't have the nuance around it. And we have, so there's our position, whatever our position in the network is, it can be scary. Like one of the things that came up with Amy's contacts last week was, well, what about the people who discover that they're not connected? They put themselves on the map and they have no connections. That is scary to the people who are imagining it. The people who have no connections, my stance is they know they have no connections. They feel marginalized. They feel outcast anyway. And wouldn't you like to know who they are so you could reach out and connect to them? How are you going to ever connect to them if you can't see that on the map? But for most people, there's just like revealing stuff about our relationships is just really uncomfortable. And especially for those of us for whom it's not like this happy, we're all going to be connected and all the world's going to be perfect just because we're all connected kind of a stance. For anybody who doesn't feel it that way, or who knows deep in their heart that there's ways their place in the structure is uncomfortable for them, it's scary. And it comes up all the time. But here's the thing, it will only come up if, as a facilitator, you are approachable enough to let it come up. I've seen lots of contexts where people are like, it's gonna be wonderful, and this is what we're gonna do, and everybody's gonna love seeing all these things, and then people don't participate because they haven't gotten through that threat. So, yeah. And then as the leaders, we're going, why aren't they participating? And over time, I started to go, well, maybe it's because it's scary and nobody else helped us think about the benefits of the scariness. Okay, and clearly, this is one of those places where you put a quarter in me and I just go on and on and on. So I'm especially, the Seth was wondering what was going on in Seth's head because you haven't said anything. So I'm glad you raised your hand.
Next question, I have just a clarifying question.
Yep.
When you say, when you refer to connections, are you referring to, there's different kinds of connections reflected on a map. There's the explicit connections, which from a sumApp perspective are what people filled in when they, when they said, I have a relationship with somebody. And there's the implicit connections, which are described in terms of people who might have a similar, might answer similar questions about themselves in their profile. It sounds like you're referring and lamenting specifically about the first kind of the explicit connections as opposed to the implicit. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay. So my reaction is that I think that I've been devaluing the explicit connections as well in the project I'm currently working on, which is really, I mean, Tim mentioned about a directory, which is a list of people. And I'm working from that perspective outward to make it something that's more, that creates more connections and stuff like that within a boundaried network, which happens to also be an organization. And so, I think that networks exist all around us in many different scales and forms and interconnected ways of being. And they're usually, and in most cases, they're not recognized as networks. They're not explicitly, named as a network and stuff like that. And the value of naming a network or having a network become more self-aware is that it has the opportunity to be more effective in whatever its intention is. So I've been thinking and focusing more on the ways in which in which I can create opportunities for people within the network to identify aspects about themselves, to kind of raise their hand, so to speak, about a particular aspect of something, so that they can then, provide basically what I think of as a networking hook that's then available for someone else to reach out and connect with them. And I think the implicit connections are at least as important as the explicit connections once they're identified, or that they can be identified. And I think it's often, I've recognized what you mentioned before about the discomfort that people often feel about making the explicit connections, especially if they feel like it might not be reciprocated. And that's something that tends to put a damper on people's ability to express their desire to, the desire to disclose a connection with someone else. And yet, I think that people are much more amenable to disclosing information about themselves, especially within a boundaried, trusted environment, that then can expose those implicit connections.
Yeah.
And I think that I would value the implicit connections as well as the explicit connections more.
And I hear that, and I affirm the validity of that perspective, and I affirm that oftentimes you have to start with the implicit and get people comfortable with the map or comfortable with the context, or even beginning to think about the value of connections, et cetera. So starting with those implicit or can't remember the word I use for them, but those non-explicit connections. And my sense is that we are so deeply ingrained in our norms and in our habits of interaction and preference, and so deeply uncomfortable across conflicts and differences, that if we don't at some point start to include explicit connections, we will be blocked without understanding what's blocking us, and we will be this is too strong a language, this is my triggered language, but just creating a bunch of echo chambers. But it's that flow across the differences in a self-organizing system, that flow across those differences, that is what makes it resilient and self-organizing. And we as human beings have a really hard time doing that. And we have a hard time even wanting to have it visualized. And so to me, on the surface, the implicit connections are great, but if we push into wanting to do true change, they're just another thing that we can find in a lot of places. And what we can't find easily, and we don't have the mental habits of really thinking deeply about, is those explicit connections. So to me, they are more of a deeper, more rumbling, and the implicit are sort of more of a, and so clearly I'm saying I value the explicit connections, even if they're hardly updated, even if they're really not meaningful, they're a step in a direction of really deepening our understanding of our thinking about flow across, especially across challenging gaps. And that's why I built sumApp. That's why I do social system mapping. And so for me, it's totally valid for anybody else to use the tool however they want. And it's totally valid for other people to not share that value. But in this context of our community practice, I will promote the value of explicit connections and not want implicit connections to be said, to be framed as equal.
I can see that, and yet I also feel like not all explicit connections are revealed on the map or need to be.
No, there, and I know there's a lot more complexity to this, and I don't want to, I don't want to argue my point. I just want to say that if we pretend, if we say, not pretend, the bad word, if we say they're equal, we're telling people you don't need to go to this much more complex, much more challenging, much more potentially dangerous, much more potentially transformative place. Doesn't mean that no, they're not all on the map. That's an interesting conversation to have in a group, is why aren't they all on the map? And no, they're often, and this is not what this conversation is for, is to dig deeper into the shortcomings of the explicit connections on a map. I know there are a bazillion, and I'm just saying, I think it's important for us to be at some point willing to go there and to explore those with other people. And we're close to the end. I want to know, Seth, are you willing to let this go here?
Yeah, I want to pursue it, but maybe in the next half hour.
Okay. We'll see. We'll see how pursuable it is in the next half hour, but yeah, thanks. Okay, so I'm going to hand it over to Kara to make announcements, and then we'll do our goodbye ritual, and those of you who need to go can jump off, and at least Seth and I will remain.
Excellent. So our next sense-making session, we will not be having until October 7th. We'll be taking the Labor Day Monday off. And then our next on-ramp will be coming up on September 9th, which is always the second Monday of the month. And for our next deep dive session, that will be on September 16th. I'll put links in the chat in just a moment here.
And how many of those do we know the topic for? I think we might know the topic for one or none.
I did not have the topic, so I'll have to peek back, but I think the on-ramp, I'm still looking for somebody. If Amy knows her sense-making topic for October, she could share that, and then I can peek at the deep dive.
It's not necessary, we haven't decided that. Yeah. I'm going to talk about the landscape diagram. We have not collectively decided that, but we have been planning on me doing that at some point, and I think that's a good time, so I don't think I will make sure that I will check for dissent, so that might change, but my sense is that's what we'll do. Okay. Then let's just go ahead and do our goodbye ritual and give you an extra maybe half a minute, and then we'll stick around, and whoever wants to stick around, and we'll see what happens. So everyone unmute if you're going to do this with us. Regine, I think you know the goodbye ritual. It's very simple. Okay. So just unmute. 3, 2, 1. Thank you, everybody.
Thank
you.
you.
Hey,
Bye-bye.
thanks.
Have a great
Have a
day.
good day.
See everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Regina,
I'm gonna let you guys talk it out, and I'm gonna digest. So I will be at the September one.
can I just ask a question? Do you have 2 minutes?
I have time. Yeah, I didn't want to. Yeah.
Yeah. I just am wondering if there was any piece of that felt relevant and helpful to your conversation. I was hoping that the underlying.
Actually, yeah. Actually, yes. Because I'm already getting pushback about this idea of why we need to do, and so they are my clients, and also this whole idea of pushing forward even when there's tension and conflict being necessary. I understand that too. I still don't yet know how to use the maps or how to introduce them, so I'm learning. But yeah, I did find today. I just think it's wonderful that you have this, and that you have this group, and that you're doing these things. So I'm not there yet in terms of understanding everything, but I'm getting there. So
Well, my sense is that you're there yet in a lot of underlying philosophical ways that that other people take a longer time to get to, and it's just the sort of the technical stuff that you're not there yet with.
exactly. Yeah, I think that's true.
Yeah.
But I have reached capacity right now, so I'm gonna let you guys have this little conversation, and I will see everyone again. And thank you. All
Yeah.
right.
Okay. Thanks.
Thanks, Regine.
Bye-bye.
Bye, Regine. Good to have you. And I'm going to sit myself down before we.
Christine, I was gonna say that I really appreciated this, and I don't know if I'm gonna stay or not. I'm gonna see where the conversation goes, because I also feel like I need to just sit with it. But and particularly thinking about the context of the client that you're working with me on, is just the value of being able to articulate the value of, and at least from where I sit and the kind of work that I do and hope to do is, and just even that, it's like, I feel like I need to go away and, think about how do I articulate the value. And I'm also wrestling with the language of scary and dangerous.
Yeah.
And trying to think that through.
Yeah.
So I'm just it's in my head right now. So I just was going to appreciate the conversation.
Yeah. Thanks. And I'd love to, if you like, we'll see where it goes, but well, you and I will talk more about it at any rate, but yeah. Seth, I'm having Seth, I'm having some anxiety about our relationship, which happens for me when I have a difference of opinion with somebody that I respect and care to be in relationship with, and that I actually persist in articulating my difference. So I'm just saying, not I don't need you to take care of me about it. I don't need you to fix it. I just need to say that I'm sitting with that little bit of discomfort because I value you and respect you a great deal.
Well, I appreciate your saying that and articulating the struggle that you're going through, because I think that that's maybe the price of thought leaders, you know, who are pushing forward on some of this stuff to struggle with that, so that some of the rest of us who come behind don't have to.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that you're struggling with that, and it provokes a lot of interesting thoughts and challenges for me. What I wanted to ask about was not in any way to dispute what you're saying about implicit versus explicit, but I'm trying to understand. I struggle as well with implicit and explicit relationships, and one of the features that I'm planning to build into my map is in the survey section to have people indicate whether they are in a kind of a yes/no question. Are you willing to be open to being approached by someone else for a 20-minute conversation to introduce yourself or to find out about what, you know, to share 10 minutes with each other about what you're doing? And I think of that as being a way to encourage explicit relationships. But I don't know that, you know, I've gone back and forth a little bit about whether that should be reflected on the map. So I know, like, just to take an example, that Jim and I have done something like this where we had a meeting a couple of years ago just to like get to know one another and meet one another and stuff like that. That meeting itself is not reflected on the map, though, you know, we have a relationship on the current map and stuff like that. And so I think it's important to encourage explicit relationships and to encourage more connection, because that's, you know, the ecological metaphor of any network is the more diverse the connections, the healthier the network is. But I'm not sure that all those things need to or can be reflected on the map. You know, within any community, there's all these relationships, and they're never going to be all reflected on the map, because maps are just a representation of reality. And like a physical map, you know, it has to be selective about what it discloses. So I think there's ways of building community and strengthening networks that a map can facilitate, but doesn't necessarily get reflected on the map itself. And that's just things I'm thinking about.
Yeah, and I get the I mean, we never want to say, so there's a tiny bit of either orness that's often going on in this conversation, which is either we do map the explicit connections or we don't map the explicit connections. And or if we, let me put it a different way. If we map the explicit connections, then we have to try and get everybody to share all their connections. So it's like this, either everybody does it or nobody does it. And that's one way of holding it. And I think that's part of what's challenging. But the other thing you said, which was, and I don't have the words in front of me, but we have to be selective about what we show on a map, because it's just a representation. It's not going to ever be reality or have all of reality in it. And to me, even if you don't have a whole lot of what you would consider super informative, like you don't have a robust set of connections, if you're inviting people, even just having the member tiles, and like we used to do this map with, you know, 1,200 people every year that wasn't trying to be a real network. It wasn't trying to, it was just leaders, local leaders in the Twin Cities. And we would, but they wanted people to start thinking about networks and being sensitized to networks. So we did the social system map, and people would come up to me when we would have this display and we would be there all day. And people would come up to me and say, you know, it was great. I went through the list of members And I saw, and I actually discovered that there were a number of people that I know who were coming to this, and I reached out to them ahead of time and invited them to meet me for coffee at 10 at this place, or, like they actually just seeing a bunch of 1,200 member tiles on a page actually triggered outreach behaviors and appreciation and thinking about relationships. When we didn't tell them to do that, it wasn't a place that was deeply primed for this kind of thinking at all, but it happened because we had the member tiles there. And so even if, a very small population ever gave their, I mean, they did more and more over time, gave more connections, but even if a very small population, even if people don't do anything on the map, just being asked to think about, who do you know? Who are you connected to? How are you connected to them at all? Begins to shift our thinking. And
Right.
so if it doesn't even if it doesn't end up on the map. So my stance is, and then someone will say, well, it's not the whole population or blah, blah, blah. And then any critique whatsoever can be an opportunity to dig into our expectations, to dig into what's missing, why might it be missing. Any pushback whatsoever can be an opportunity to deepen the conversation about system change, about relationship, about how we do this thing we say we're going to do. And so I think my biggest message is not to be afraid of the pushback, but to be looking for it as opportunities to just ease into a deeper discussion. And I just want to say one other thing, and I know I'm not doing a good job of keeping the loops, but I'm not saying that you should put explicit connections on your map this year. I'm not saying that. I'm saying you decide, it's your context, you know what you're doing, you know what the capacity is, and you know the right starting point. And I just want to encourage you to keep looking for openings that can move it a little bit further. I'm not telling anybody jump over people's readiness, leapfrog over their capacity and try and force anything. Won't work. So I'm not saying you should do anything different right now, but I'm asking you to consider two things, one of which is just looking for those opportunities and saying, okay, maybe now is the time. Maybe we do add this. Maybe I'm ready to start having these conversations. And the other thing I'm asking everyone to consider is to help me frame it in this more positive towards explicit connections way, as opposed to getting uncomfortable, like just saying, they told me no, so I'm not ever going to do it. Like when that's preached in my context, I get triggered because it's like, no, I understand the impulse and it's fine if you do it. And it's fine if you even say, I couldn't go there and I'm not going to go there. But I think it's really important for everybody else to move. I mean, it's even just to distinguish your own stance from the framing that I'm trying to bring forward is that's really what I wanted from Ben. I didn't want him to change anything he did. I just wanted him to say, yeah, and it's too bad we couldn't do that, or, just like frame it differently rather than push back against me and tell me that my stance is not relevant in this context. It's not relevant for his context. That's true. Doesn't matter. But this is a community practice around social system mapping, and it does matter here. And so I just want us to be sensitive to that framing without telling anybody to lie or pretend they feel something they don't. I'm just wanting to know does that?
I think so. I don't think we're in that much disagreement.
No, I don't think so.
I think the shared objective, I would think, is to help networks be more self-aware, self-actualized, impactful, effective, robust. And I think these are the things that we want to use mapping to help to achieve.
Yeah.
And there's a plethora of tools within the map to help do that.
Yeah. Jim.
I want to explore a couple of thoughts with y'all. First off, I really appreciate that you went here, Christine, even though it was difficult and uncomfortable. Thank you. This was really great. Second thing is, Seth, this just thinking about implicit versus explicit, for some reason, I just never had vocabulary for it exactly. But I think it's really important. So the first thought I had was, you had mentioned, Christine, about, our implicit connections are often about affinities. Oh, I'm like this person. And I always lead with that. Who are your people, so that you can get together and stuff like that. But it's also a way of showing differences. And we could think about and articulate those differences that we see on the map as a way of easing into an implicit tension. And I'm thinking of like entry points, ways to get to this, maybe a less safe place of showing certain explicit kind of interactions. And another caveat, thanks for again pointing out the privilege. I feel very safe in throwing out my relationships in a public way. And it's like, yeah, watch it, Jim. So paying attention to that spectrum of safety is something that needs to be on my agenda. But anyway, that was one way. Can we use implicit differences to use that tension? And another thing is that, when we go awareness, connection, spectrum of awareness, generative connection, collaboration, something like that, there could be very operational measures of your connection that aren't threatening, but that are explicit and that are tied to purpose. So for example, in my relational coordination, collaborative, we're supposed to be a collaborative, we're supposed to be collaborating. And sometimes that's a step too far to actually collaborate on something, but there's some intermediate steps that start to get you to more collaborative. I've shared information with this person, X, Y, and Z activities that are operational, that could potentially not be so scary. And that might also be another way to ease into more less safe places. That's just like, yeah, we said we were trying to collaborate. Well, what are the steps to get there, and are we doing that? So that it's, yeah. So I just think there are maybe many ways to come at this, and I also like this idea of any pushback as an opportunity.
Yeah, Amy, the scary and the threatening is not language I would use with most clients, certainly not in a group. I might say it to my one-on-one, like if I'm working with you, I might say it to you, or, I might say it to the person I'm working most closely with, but if we've already developed a lot of trust, and I'll just say that this being able to articulate it, I mean, I think there's two things that are coming up for me in these conversations is, one, the need for us as mappers to have more practice and more capacity to articulate that benefit. And I have done this now for 10 years. And for, I'd say, most of those years, I just backed up, I just shut down, I just surrendered. And I have seen the error of my ways. I have seen lots of maps, not for just that reason, but for a lot of reasons, not have any longevity and not be super successful. And so I've learned the hard way that stepping into that discomfort I've learned it both the hard way and then the beneficial way, by seeing that when I have stepped into that discomfort, how it actually can make shifts. So what I'm saying is, it's not surprising. I don't expect anybody else to be able to have this conversation because you haven't been in it and experienced both sides of it enough times and gotten triggered by it and argued in your, like I would, like surrender. And then a while later I'd be like, man, that was so stupid. Like and then I would be arguing in my head why it's important and blah, 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 blah. And it would come out with all this sort of triggered, pissed off language. And then I would be like, well, I'm not going to say that. to my clients. So then I would say nothing again. And, you know, so I've had to go through this whole iteration of the way my mind works to get to getting closer to be able to articulate it as a benefit. And so part of this is I want us to avail ourselves of that experience of mine and learn from it rather than get afraid. And that was one thing that's coming up, is just like the language and the articulation. And the other thing that's coming up is, Jim, as you're talking about, there's got to be a lot of ways. In every single, like every context has its own ways, and every context is a unique place. And so what we need to do is just increase our creativity around how do we embrace the pushback? How do we embrace the fear that's going on? And not in a way that threatens or is like, you know, blah, blah, beat people over the head, but is like, yeah, it is scary. And what if? And then maybe, and then they go, or you could just say, yeah, it is. But if you think of it from their perspective, like how would, you know, like just finding getting creative about finding the openings and stepping into them generatively for the specific context. And I feel like we don't have either the articulation piece or the, how do I step in and implement, you know, the ways we can implement it contextually. And those are things I'd love for us to focus, you know, put some more thought into collectively, because I see it all the time. And while I'm pretty comfortable with it now and can just kind of go, but yeah.
I have a connection.
And that's part of what's triggering for me, is it's like, if we say it's hard, don't go there, then we're not saying, oh, Christine, I know you've dealt with this a whole lot of times, and you know, what do you think? Or we're not actually taking advantage of what's here to be utilized for moving forward. Okay, I'm gonna shut up now. Yes, Jim, what were you gonna say?
I have a question for you all, but Amy, I was wondering if you wanted to have a chance to react.
I'm good, Jim. Thank you.
Well, so the question goes along with what Seth said about, you know, so how he and I got together. That was an activity. Presumably, it built connection. So operationally, you could ask the question, have you gotten together with? Who have you gotten together with? A connection question. It's explicit. And just assume that something happened good. You don't have to ask, am I building stronger connection with Seth? We don't necessarily, and presumably that's a scarier place. Like, what does Seth feel about me? It's like, we don't actually have to go there. We can probably make some assumptions at a crude level that we have now got something that we didn't before, and that there's high quality connection and the residual value that brings, according to Dutton and Heafy, that good things happen just from the operational perspective of we connected. We can map that, and maybe that's an entry point.
So I just a couple of, this is, since we're going to sort of problem solving at a very granular level, I have met with a bazillion people that I will never collaborate with. So knowing that I have met with somebody often means that I have discovered that I don't want a relationship with them more often than not, frankly. So I think that's and so there's just that one thing, just as a here's a shortcoming of how we, like, there's no way we're going to get a perfect solution. And that may be a perfect starting point. And when you say, so we don't need to do X, I feel like what would be very helpful, what would soothe my heart, is to say, so maybe in this kind of a context, we don't need to do X yet. But when you say we don't need to do X, that sounds to everybody like we don't need to do X, period, ever, anywhere. And that's what I object. That's where I get triggered, is when we actually make an absolute statement that it's not necessary. And I'm not saying you can't be contextual. I'm just saying be contextual. and not like overall should or shouldn't kind of a thing.
Yeah, good point.
Because every context is different. And in lots of places, you do need to do X if you're going to get at your goals. Thank you all for staying present when I get a little triggered and activated. Seth, I'm wondering what's going on in your head at this point.
I just wanted to thank you for being so vulnerable, for being willing to be so vulnerable. And I think that speaks to the trust and the safety of the community, which is all the more impressive because it's not a closed community. So, you know, you were gonna express your vulnerability and your uncertainty and your triggeredness and stuff for this session without knowing who was going to show up.
Yep.
And could have been strangers showing up who you wouldn't know anything about, and could have been some of the people that you never want to collaborate with anymore. Could have shown up. And so I think that I want to appreciate your willingness to push forward with that, with this community that is, you know, a combination of, I mean, there's different levels of trust within the community and stuff. And so I commend you for doing that and for
Thank you.
helping us all to challenge our own thinking about this.
Thanks. I appreciate that. Is there anything else that anybody wants to spend the last few minutes on? And Amy, I noticed you did stick around. I look forward to having a deeper discussion about this.
I know, right? As soon
Your
as we get off,
context.
I'm getting to work on my connection questions. Yeah, no, this has been good. And I think, yes, yes, I'm glad that you brought it up, because for, like you said, it's in my bones. Like, I don't even question that we wouldn't have the explicit connections. And yet, being better prepared to step in when there is pushback.
Yeah.
It's just good. Really
Yeah.
good awareness.
Yeah.
So thanks.
I feel like it's kind of like doing your piano scales or your basketball practice. Like I wonder, how can we create contexts where we can just repeatedly get pushback, all kinds of pushback, and just see what, and just like try to respond calmly and articulately and succinctly, and just practice that. That would be a cool thing for us to have. But anyway, yeah.
You know, one other thing that was really useful to me early on, Christine, you said, connecting it to your purpose, or maybe Seth said it, I don't know. But if purpose in my community is collaboration, if it's about collaboration, I mean, that's something I can say to my community. If we're about collaboration, what are those relationships that help us achieve that? And, or if it's about building bridges across differences, how do we show that we're doing that? And just so bringing it back to community purpose, just explicitly, which I've always said that it's about achieving, this visualization is about achieving our purpose, but to be explicit and bring that question back to the community forces them to think about what are those relationships.
And I would say that even if it's not about collaboration, whatever it's about, if it's got any kind of transformational or system change intention, if we think about a complex adaptive system and we think about what Seth said earlier about the robustness of flow across differences, how do we know if that's happening? We don't know. I mean, whether it's we're collaborating together, or whether it's we're giving each other resources, or whether it's we're training each other in our expertises, or whether if it's we're just having like difficult conversations from really opposite sides of the fence, whatever it is, how do we know if granted, we won't know absolutely and 100% if it is or isn't happening anywhere with the social system app. We won't ever get absolute knowledge, but we can begin to appreciate the value of seeing it if we do ask for it, and just using those as a piece of as a conversational prompt. But if we don't even ask, how are we really going to have a sense of are these things happening or aren't they happening? Whatever the flow across difference is, or the flow within difference. I mean, there's, but whatever the flow is that we're hoping for, we won't have any, but the most, we get anecdotal evidence, we get stories from people, but if I tell you, I mean, you're going to hear my stories. You're not going to hear the stories of the guy who lives in Australia, who's doesn't show up to our community of practice. And he may have a very different story from what's going on in this community than I do. And so if you just hear my story and my 3 anecdotes, or me and Amy's 2 anecdotes, you might think that's the truth, but you might be missing out on a whole lot of other anecdotes that contradict it. So so I'm just saying there's a limit to anecdotal evidence as well as a limit to visualized data, and combining them can help us have could potentially help us have a fuller picture if we help people get over their concern about it. Okay, that was a lot of yapping I just did. I appreciate you all being present for it. Shall we let's do a quick round of just what we're taking away. I know this isn't the formal session, but I'd just like to hear from each of you in 25 seconds each.
Well, I feel challenged to think about some things in ways I hadn't before. I appreciate that.
Yay, I love that.
Ditto.
Yay.
And like I said, I'm literally going to go work on some draft connection questions so that you and I can continue this with a real live working case this afternoon. So
Great.
Thank you.
Yeah. Kara, did you want to say anything?
The importance of being transparently vulnerable. I think sometimes we don't know who that might hit with, but we're not being open to share.
Thanks. Cool. Okay. Have a wonderful day, y'all. See you next
Thank
time.
y'all.
Take
Thank
care.
you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.